May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts always be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. When J.B. Phillips came to translate the New Testament, he was quite surprised by the impact it had on him. He said this: "I have read in Greek and Latin scores of myths, but I do not find the slightest flavour of myth here. No man could have set down such artless and vulnerable accounts as these, unless some real event lay behind them." And he described the New Testament as having within it the ring of truth. It was passages like the one we have before us today that really impressed him. Another writer, William Barclay, wrote, "No one can read this passage without being struck with the staggering honesty of the New Testament." And he went on to comment that there never was a story in history more likely to have been hushed up than this one. And yet, it's something that's in all four of the Gospels. And why should it have been hushed up? Because it concerns Simon Peter, the man who became the leader of the early church, the great preacher of the day of Pentecost, the man claimed by the Roman Catholic Church as the very first Bishop of Rome. And it doesn't paint him in a good light. Indeed, it paints him as a failure and a coward. Yet all four of the Gospels, as we've said, contain this incident, and each one of them, as is typical in truthful witness accounts, adds just this little extra detail here or there, so that the story builds up. And we'll be quoting from all four of the Gospels this morning. So the story. The evening had not started well. Jesus had turned to the 12 apostles and told them that they were all going to let him down. "This very night you will all fall away on account of me," he said, "for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee." Now Peter will have none of it. He replies, "Even if all fall away on account of you, I never will." And Jesus turns round and tells him, "Truly, I tell you, this very night, before the cock crows, you will have disowned me 3 times. Peter still isn't having any of it, and neither are the rest of the disciples. They cannot, at this stage, foresee any circumstance in which they will let him down so badly. Peter declares, "Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you." And all the other disciples said the same. But then after the meal, the 11 disciples, 11 because Judas had left on some errand partway through the evening, the 11 disciples had headed out with Jesus out into the darkness, out beyond the city walls, to an olive press called the Garden of Gethsemane. They might well have presumed that there was just going to be a short wait here, and Judas would catch up with them, and then they'd go off for the night. And here Jesus asked them a favour, that they would watch with him as he prayed. But whether it was the lateness of the hour or the wine that they would have consumed with the Passover meal, they all fell asleep. It would have been such a simple request to stay awake and watch with Jesus, and they hadn't been able to do even that. Twice Jesus repeated the request, and twice more he came back and found that they'd dropped off. And on this third occasion, he says to the disciples, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Look, the hour has come, and the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." They had indeed been waiting for Judas, but he was coming back in a way that none of them, other than Jesus, had expected, at the head of an arrest party, armed with swords and clubs. Judas greets Jesus, as had been the agreed signal, with a kiss, and the party closes in. Briefly, Peter tries to put up a fight, lashing out with a sword that he'd brought with him, and succeeds in cutting off the ear of a servant of the high priest, whom John names as Malchus. But Jesus will have none of it and tells them all to put away their swords, reaching out and in his very last work of healing, touches Malchus's head and heals the wound of his ear. There is a brief scuffle as the soldiers try and grab some of the members of Jesus' party, but most of them run and all get away, probably running to Bethany and the home of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, where it's assumed they were staying. The arresting party, having got the man they were after, go back into the city and take Jesus to be interrogated by Caiaphas, the high priest. But in the chaos and confusion, two of the disciples had managed to mingle with the crowd. Peter and John had not been spotted. John tells us himself that somehow he was known in the high priest's household. Why he was known, we don't know. People have speculated that he might have been the Jerusalem representative of the fish-selling business, Zebedee and Sons, purveyors of fresh fish to the nobility. Whatever. Anyway, John gets in, and then he comes back and speaks to the servant girl on duty on the gate. And she lets Peter in as well. Mark tells us that she stared intently at Peter. And as she lets him in, and then as Peter stands beside the fire, and then maybe someone throws a log on the brazier, the fire blazes up. And for the first time, she sees Peter's face clearly, and she blurts out, "You also were with Jesus of Galilee. You're one of them." But he denied it before them all. "I don't know what you're talking about," Peter said. Just a slip of a girl, and the big, strong fisherman cowers away. As Richard Glover comments, it was a great temptation by an offhand lie to parry an offhand question and so preserve his privacy. Peter moves away from the light to somewhere a bit safer, a bit darker, but in vain, because another of the girls follows him out. Matthew writes, "Then he went out to the gateway where another servant girl saw him and said to the people there, 'This fellow was with Jesus of Nazareth.' He denied it again with an oath. 'I don't know the man.' He swears it on oath. It's getting worse. The third denial, we are told by John, came in response to a challenge from a man who was a relative of Malchus, the man whose ear Peter had cut off just an hour or two before in the Garden of Gethsemane. And all the people around him join in with what he's saying. Matthew says, after a little while, those standing there went up to Peter and said, "Surely you are one of them. Your accent gives you away." Peter had been given away by his distinctive northern accent. Apparently, the Galileans had so ugly and distinctive an accent that no Galilean was allowed to pronounce the blessing at the end of a synagogue service. It says that Peter then began to call down curses, and he swore to them, "I don't know the man." This causes an avalanche of denials. Peter calls down curses, presumably on Jesus, and it all only comes to an end when out of the darkness a cock crowed. heralding the beginning of a new day. And Matthew says simply, immediately a cock crowed. And Peter pauses, and Luke records that Jesus, presumably being taken to another room or house for more questions, looked straight at him. Then Peter remembered the word Jesus had spoken. Before the cock crows, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. So, what lessons are we to draw from this? Well, we must beware of presumptuousness, the feeling that somehow we're a special case, that this may be someone else's problem, but it'll never be mine. I would never fall for that. We need to be aware that sometimes people, and people means you and me, break down in the area where they think they're strongest. And Peter was brave. He'd been ready to fight in the garden when fighting meant almost certain death. And he then followed the crowd into the lion's den, risking discovery. And yet he'd failed. We all need to pray for the power to confess him, even at the times which are most embarrassing or inconvenient. George Beasley Murray, commenting on this passage, asked 2 questions. He says, how did it happen that Peter let Jesus down so badly? And he suggests that Peter had never taken seriously Jesus' warnings that he was going to suffer and be executed, and therefore he hadn't also taken Jesus' words about the necessity of carrying his own cross. But then George Beasley Murray asks, how did it happened that the church let Peter down so badly? This story, as we've already observed, is in each of the 4 Gospels. How was it that they insisted on telling the story of the most embarrassing failure of their leader? The answer is that the reason each of the Gospels includes this is that Peter insisted on telling the story about himself in all its shocking detail, to give glory to the Lord who had forgiven him, as he does to all who truly turn from their sin, and to encourage all Christians to do better than he did when called to account for their faith. But maybe you are sitting there listening to this and thinking, I've let Jesus down. Can he ever have me back? Of course he can. Our God is the God of the second chance. He longs to give you a second chance. He longs for you to take him up on that offer because he's the God of grace. That means that he will always be the God of the second chance and the third chance and the 4th chance and the 10th chance, the 51st, the 593rd chance, because he's a God of grace and he wants you to come and accept his forgiveness and his help. And that, like Peter, he still has things for you to do in this world. Amen.